Hi, Acadiana. I'm Meteorologist Dave Baker. Welcome to your Thursday. This is Let's Talk Tropics right here on Acadiana Weather Today. Got a couple of named storms that are out in the Atlantic Ocean. We've got a tropical depression that's on the Pacific side that we're going to talk about a little bit more. And we also have the disturbed weather that's been kind of spinning around the Western Caribbean, southern part of the Gulf of Mexico. A lot of different pieces there, but some good news. The National Hurricane Center kind of lowering the chances for development a little bit farther toward the south. But it is something that we'll still need to watch over the next several days, as it will probably start to bring a little bit more rain back into the picture here at home. So getting started, temperature holding at 87 right now over at Lafayette Regional Airport. Our dew point is at 65, so that's still relatively low, but it's going to be on the climb today as some moisture starts to roll in here off the Gulf of Mexico. Heat index at 89, which isn't too bad by Louisiana standards. Humidity 48%, and we've got a nice breeze out of the northeast at around 9 miles per hour. There are some showers, though, that are well out into the offshore waters, and if you're going to be doing some boating far offshore, you may have some problems with this, and the seas have been a little bit rougher with some gustier winds out here, but you can see that really not much is reaching land. Maybe a couple of sprinkles starting to work their way onto the southeastern Louisiana coastline. We'll pull up the Hammond radar and see. You can see down there around Grand Isle we're getting some rain, and down toward the mouth of the Mississippi River, and some of that's going to be rolling across parts of Lafourche and Terrebonne Parish, and maybe even St. Mary kind of getting in on that action a little bit later on. So the rain chance is only about 10%, and it's primarily going to be for our friends that are there right along the coast. Looking at our traffic cams, though, we've generally got mostly sunny skies here in Lafayette. A little bit on the hazy side at times, but there will be a few puffy clouds starting to build as we get into the latter part of the afternoon. Also wanted to bring you back in time with Hurricane Lily that made landfall early in the morning of October the 3rd, 2002. So 22 years ago. I will say that that is really the first hurricane in my career. Even though I started television here in the Lafayette region back in '94, for 6 years we didn't have, or for 8 years rather, we didn't have anything really come in our direction. And at this time I lived in New Iberia. Lily got all the way up to a Category 4 storm with 145 mile per hour winds out in the offshore waters. But we ended up being very lucky as wind shear took its toll at the last minute, and also some colder waters that were right along the Gulf Coast, and that helped to weaken the hurricane down to a Category 1 with winds at 90 miles per hour at landfall, which was still a pretty strong hurricane for most of us that were here when it came through. But some of the early predictions, if this were to come on shore as a Category 4 with 140 or 150 on the winds, some of the storm surge forecasts were really incredible. And as I boarded up my house in New Iberia, my elevation there was only at about 13 feet above sea level, and some of the predictions were talking about 20-foot storm surges. And of course there was a period of time where in disbelief that there would actually be water from the Gulf of Mexico possibly reaching my house in New Iberia. Fortunately that did not happen, but I still really became more of a believer of some of these incredible storm surges, mainly after Hurricane Rita moved by and I saw how high that water could get. I was driving over the overpass there, going over kind of by where the Port of Iberia was, and you could see the water that was coming right up to Highway 90. So it was pretty interesting to see. But Hurricane Lily, we were very fortunate when it weakened. Of course, that could have been our Helene for sure, because if you think about the Big Bend areas of Florida and you think about South Louisiana, geography is very, very similar, and that could have been an incredible disaster with Hurricane Lily if it would have stayed as strong as it was when it was in the offshore waters. So looking at the tropical weather outlook, again, the National Hurricane Center kind of dropping that area there over the southern part of the Bay of Campeche and into the Gulf of Mexico down into the 30% range. So we're now down in the low end range. It was running 40% for most of the week, but dropping down. A lot of the computer models are kind of backing off, but there are still some pieces of the puzzle that we're going to talk about that might have a little bit of a chance. So it's not something that we want to stop watching. Even though the chances for development have dropped off, it is still not zero. But fortunately, as we get into October, you get some of those bigger troughs to kind of move across the country, and with cold fronts becoming a little bit stronger, they do tend to shove things a little bit farther toward the east. But even looking into next week, and I will say the models are keeping the Gulf of Mexico a little bit active, but it's still playing around with this trough of low pressure that looks like it's going to get stuck out there for maybe another week. It's already been there for a week. I know we've been talking about it for quite some time, but even with week 2, it might still be kind of active in the Gulf of Mexico, and also maybe some new development coming up in the Atlantic. But if you look at week 3, we're still looking at the western part of the Caribbean Sea, which is a typical area for tropical systems to develop as we start to get into mid and late October. So it's not really that unusual to see something there. That would be a normal kind of a map. But do look out in the Atlantic. It's kind of void of any tropical development. So maybe we're going to start to see things shutting down a little bit farther to the east. Let's hope so, as hurricane season fortunately has not been quite as busy as what the earlier forecasts were suggesting, but as we go into the mid part of October, maybe we'll start to see things starting to calm down. Very quiet from coast to coast. We've got clear skies from the west coast all the way to the New England states with a few clouds over the Appalachians, and then we've got a bit of a front that's kind of moving its way across the middle part of the country. That's going to play with us later on early next week, and then down to the south, of course, you can see there's that moisture over the southern part of the Bay of Campeche, and some of that kind of stretches northward. It's been broad trough of low pressure, and with that unstable air and a lot of moisture down there, we are seeing the showers and thunderstorms kind of getting a little bit closer to the coast. And for those of you who are working out there, or maybe you want to do some boating, those seas are going to be a little bit rougher than they would be on a normal day, with some winds gusting out of the northeast about 15 to 20, with seas running about 2 to 3 feet. But you can see there is a large area of cloudiness that's out here in the western part of the Gulf of Mexico. That's just basically a bit of a trough of low pressure. And then you see a little bit of a spin right about in here. You see that little spin? That's an upper level system. So upper lows really don't help tropical systems to develop. They kind of tend to shear them apart. And then there's a little bit more moisture here on the eastern side of that upper level low that's out over the western part of the Caribbean this afternoon. And as we look a little bit farther down toward the south, you can still see there's some pretty good activity there over the Bay of Campeche and starting to push into the western part of the Caribbean Sea. But I also wanted to point out all of the cloudiness that's out here right off the screen that's off in the Gulf of Tehuantepec. And that is Tropical Depression 11E, which is on the Pacific side, but it is forecast to kind of slide back toward the north. It could possibly become a tropical storm before landfall, and then kind of the remnants of that may scoot its way across that isthmus that's over there of Tehuantepec. That's that kind of narrow area of land that goes between the Pacific and the Gulf of Mexico. And some of the suggestions from the National Hurricane Center are thinking that maybe that could be another piece of energy that the models are looking at for the possibility of development. And as you've seen, if you've been here with Let's Talk Tropics over the last several days, you've seen the models have developed low pressure areas from the Bay of Campeche to the Yucatan to near the Texas coast, central part of the Gulf of Mexico, and it hasn't been real sure on where we want to see something develop. It's just been, and sometimes it's been multiple low pressure areas over the Gulf of Mexico. So with the disagreement in the coming models, and also what does agree is showing a bit of a trough of low pressure over the middle part of the Gulf of Mexico, it's nothing very strong. So that's why we're not as concerned right now. But as I said, the chances are not zero. And you'll also notice two big lows that are moving across the Atlantic Ocean. One of them is Kirk, which is now a major hurricane, and we'll let the GFS kind of reset here. And over the next 10 days, you can see Kirk's going to lift northward and then pulled off toward the northeast. And then Leslie, which is right there in the middle of the Atlantic there, hopefully will get caught up in a trough and pulled away as well. Looking at the Euro model, the Euro has really been the one model that's been the least robust on developing anything in this area. And over the next couple of days, or 10 days rather, you can see that there's just kind of a low, just drifting around, not anything real strong, and then eventually getting pulled out by a trough, and then possibly some more low pressure trying to develop there over the western part of the Caribbean or the southern Gulf of Mexico going into the following week, which would kind of tie in to that global tropical hazard outlook for week 2. The Canadian model has always been the most robust when it comes to developing a significant significant system over the Gulf of Mexico. But you can see with that low kind of spinning around here, it does strengthen as we get into Sunday and Monday of next week, and then kind of pulls off toward the northeast in response to a bigger trough that's going to be moving here across the northern part of the country. So that is one of the ones that is suggesting something actually developing, and unfortunately on this particular model is tracking something toward that northeastern part of the Gulf of Mexico, those that have already been kicked down by Hurricane Helene just a little over a week ago. And then finally on the Icon model, and the Icon has been always trying to develop something in the Bay of Campeche, and that's where I'm wondering if maybe it's picking up on this tropical depression that's out here in the Gulf of Tehuantepec, and then maybe going into the weekend, if what's remnant of that moves into the Gulf of Mexico, we might get some kind of a broad low pressure area to develop. But you can see here's that big trough that's moving across the northern sections, which hopefully would shove this out back into the Atlantic Ocean. And that is basically where the trends are with that low going out 7 days. Remember, the GFS goes out 16, but I'm just showing you 10 days. Euro goes out 10, Canadian goes out 10, and the Icon model only goes out 7 days. So that's a week's time there, with possibly something kind of drifting its way over toward Florida. But then on the other side, we'll go ahead and let it reset again. You've got a hurricane here. That is Kirk. You've got Tropical Storm Leslie that's down to the south. So Kirk is going to go ahead and move out of the way. But some of the models are kind of rushing Leslie maybe a little bit farther to the west for a while. At this point, it does not look like it's going to make its way toward the northern part of the Caribbean Sea. And at the very final frames of this loop, there's a really good trough that's going to start to roll off the east coast here. So hopefully that will be able to pick this up and turn it back away from the U.S. coastline. But the combination of both Kirk being a major hurricane, Leslie that's forecast to be a hurricane, and then maybe one more thing that's going to try to come off the coast here in the latter part of that forecast loop. You can see there's a bit of a low there trying to work its way off the African coast. With all of this action still rolling across the middle part of the Atlantic Ocean, there's going to be some pretty good swells here coming along the eastern coast of the United States. So that will be the effects, and of course those are going to be pretty minimal for us. As far as water temperatures, they are starting to cool down a little bit more over the northwestern part of the African coast. But where the development areas are, we still have solid 80-degree water all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. And we're also starting to see some slightly cooler temperatures in the waters off the Carolina coast. And that's a trend that we're going to continue to see as we progress through October and start to move into November. So water temperatures are pretty much on the favorable side for tropical development, but wind shear, on the other hand, may not be. There's some considerably low wind shear that's currently over parts of the Atlantic Ocean, but where Tropical Storm Leslie is and where Hurricane Kirk is, it looks like both of those are going to go ahead and kind of swing in between that. But if you look at the wind shear that's here over the northern part of the Gulf of Mexico, I think this is going to persist and possibly will even increase over the northern Gulf, which is probably part of the reasons why none of the models are going with anything super strong when it comes to development over the Gulf of Mexico. So the other couple of things that are out there, the Caribbean is fine. It's really a pretty day out there, from Jamaica to Haiti, Dominican Republic, going over to Puerto Rico, and then down through the Leeward and Windward Islands. And really all of the action in the tropics this time around is out here in the middle part of the Atlantic Ocean. Of course, standing out is Hurricane Kirk, which is now a Category 3 hurricane with winds of 125 miles per hour. Coordinates are there on the left-hand side of the screen, but I'm switching back and forth between Kirk and Leslie on the coordinates on the left-hand side. But that's the forecast track for Hurricane Kirk. It is expected to stay a major hurricane and then eventually get caught up in a trough over the northern Atlantic and curved back out, but it's still going to pretty much have hurricane force winds, even though it will be extra tropical going into the early part of next week. This could be a formidable storm as it moves over toward the British Isles in about a week to 10 days. As far as Tropical Storm Leslie, it is starting to look a little bit more organized on the satellite imagery there, maybe a bit of a center trying to show up, but it hasn't strengthened a whole lot over the last 24 hours. It did get the name late last night, and since then it's only increased its winds by about 5 miles per hour. So winds are at 45. It's at 10.1 north and 30.8 west, with winds running at about 45 miles per hour. It is forecast, though, to become a hurricane over the next several days and has a general northwesterly track. Again, we're really hoping that there's going to be some troughs that will pick this up, but right now it doesn't look like it's going to be affecting the Bahamas or the northern parts of the Caribbean islands. Bermuda, I would still be keeping a close eye on this as it moves off toward the west-northwest, but I really think those cold fronts and those troughs moving across the northern hemisphere should be able to allow a weakness to get that to push a little bit farther toward the north. But we are still kind of in a busy part of the hurricane season. We've made our way into the first few days of October, so we're still right about here on the timeline, which is equivalent to what we see in the latter part of August and September. So we're still kind of in the busiest part of the hurricane season. And here in Louisiana, we generally kind of pay really close attention until about the 20 to 25th of October. And then not only does activity overall really start to drop off as we go into November, but Louisiana strikes are almost unheard of as we go into the month of November. But the Caribbean, as well as the Bahamas, those are generally the hot spots when it comes to tropical activity for the last few weeks of the hurricane season. And don't forget, hurricane season does end on November the 30th. Well, I'm going to get out of here in just a little bit. I am about ready to head down to St. Cecilia's School to go visit some third graders here this afternoon to talk a little bit about weather. If you like my videos here, please like it and subscribe to the channel, and also turn on those notifications. And in between forecasts, between Let's Talk Tropics and Acadiana Weather Today, I urge you to follow my social media pages both on Facebook and X. I'll see you all tomorrow morning at 7:30 for Acadiana Weather Today. Until then, I hope you all have a great day.